I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. It's part of a series of meetings organized by the Polish Humanitarian Action. The focus of these meetings is hate speech online. My name is Agata Kasprolewicz. I am a journalist working on the Report about the State of the World podcast, and my guest and your guest, ladies and gentlemen, is Tomasz Stawiszyński, philosopher, essayist, columnist. You can read him every week in the Tygodnik Powszechny Weekly, an author of the Skądinąd podcast and an author of a show on Talk FM Radio, also an author of many wonderful books, including the last book, Escape from Helplessness. Hello and welcome. Good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm so happy that I can be part of this first webinar, and a small correction, my column appears bi-weekly in the Tygodnik Powszechny. All right, good. So yes, this is the first webinar, and a very unique one at that, because it is a unique day. February 24th, 2020 will go down in history as the day when Russia started a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We are already seeing the first victims, and we have a full-blown war. This is a subject we cannot shirk from, and we cannot start this meeting differently than by mentioning the war, which is casting a shadow on our sense of security and perhaps also on our future. War is changing. Today's war is very different than it was many decades ago. Some say that this may be the first such serious conflict for many decades. We have become used to the fact that there is peace, at least in our part of the world, and yet this war, as I have mentioned earlier, is changing, and it has a more complex picture. And the language, because today we'll be talking about the language of hatred, so the language is becoming, or I believe we may infer that, language is partially becoming a tool of war. Because if one of very serious strategies of war becomes disinformation and sowing untruth and concern and worry, and also inciting hatred with language, then it seems to me that we are living in times when language is perhaps more destructive than ever before. So that is the question that I would like us to start with, also in the context of these events that we are witnessing today and that we will be witnessing over the coming days and probably weeks. What do you think is the connection between language and hate? Would you say that indeed, looking at it also from a philosophical or historical perspective, would you say this connection is so strong that we could consider language a tool of war? Yes, I think we may do that. Let me answer right away that definitely it is a tool of war, but before we dive deeper into the subject, there's a little bit that I would like to say about today and about everything that is currently taking place in Ukraine. Starting late at night, because that is when this invasion, the aggression began. I have an impression that on one hand, this is something that everyone has been expecting, at least from a certain moment. We were able to see that the escalation of the conflict has gone so far. We could see that Russia's military is surrounding the Ukrainian border from different sides. We could see also a full arsenal of disinformation and narrative techniques being applied in this operation. However, I think up to the final moment, we were all probably believing that the Donbass, Lugansk, and Donetsk will be enough for Putin, and that a fully fledged 100% and fully classic, I may say, war may still be avoided. Let me just remind you that most of the pundits, the experts and people that focus on Russia and have been focusing on professionally for many years, they were with full confidence saying that all these actions are just posturing, that these are maneuvers intended at exerting a certain psychological pressure and impression. And after all, if somebody was planning to conduct an invasion, they wouldn't announce it so openly, but instead they would just carry it out suddenly without any warning signs. But it turns out that it is very different than what the experts thought. The invasion indeed took place. Moreover, and I believe this is another painful lesson we are learning, and also a lesson that shows that in our thinking of certain things we've grown distant from reality, because this is not a hybrid war. It is not a war conducted with these modern tools of information technology and cyber warfare, etc. Now, of course, these are also taking place, and this is an inseparable aspect of what is happening. But, and I believe here is the source of the confusion, shock, and fear, and the sense that reality has become destabilized, the reality we knew, and that's a reality that was far from stabilization after the 2 years of the pandemic, and then following the economic crisis, and before that, the World Trade Center attacks. But we had a feeling, at least to some degree, that this reality is tamed, and that we know it, and that at least some of us feel rather secure in it. Let me interrupt you right here, Tomasz, because I believe that the fact that we have deluded ourselves into taming this reality, it is also an outcome of the language. It is the way in which the media and how we among one another have been talking about what happened in the eastern Ukraine and what happened in Russia, by not referring to it as a war, by calling it a conflict or labeling it otherwise. But yes, indeed, in this case, language has a tremendous psychological significance, but also, it turns out, a psychological significance. I would like to draw attention to the language used by Russia in their communication of what is happening, and of them talking about the reasons of this invasion and what its purpose is and who invaded whom and to what end. I carefully listened to both speeches by Vladimir Putin, one that lasted almost 1 hour from a couple of days before, and then a new fresh one that was broadcast at night, and apparently it was pre-recorded. So actually, in these speeches, there is no mention of invasion, aggression, or war. Instead, there is talk of actually a peacekeeping operation, and the fact that Ukraine is governed by a Nazi regime that is carrying out genocide against the populace of those independent republics, and that these republics have then turned for assistance to Russia to stop that genocide, and that Russia has decided to provide that assistance. Now, what we are referring to as war, invasion, as aggression, they are referring to in Russia as a demilitarization. Oops, it appears that we have a bit of a malfunction, a problem with the internet connection, and I think that's on Tomasz's end. Yes? Oh, did I freeze for a second? Yes, you froze for a second, but please do go on. Yes, so I was just saying that we need to pay very close attention to how this is being talked about and how this narrative, also via different Russian media and their allies, implicit and explicit, and allies that are in Russia, Europe, and the United States, how it's being communicated, because it does seem that in a world of information technologies and digital technologies that are affecting every and touching every centimeter of our world and our life, it seems that whoever controls the message and whoever can develop a convincing narrative using to that different means not just narrative as in a language of concepts of words, but also a language of images, because that is also a language, as images also come together to create a narrative. So whoever can control that and use that, and whoever can develop it convincingly, that one has power. And I think Putin has understood this a long time ago, because Putin is actually a specialist in completely not caring about any reality apart from discursive reality. As Peter Pomeranz says, and he's a very interesting essayist, a British essayist of Russian origin, he says that Putin is a truly postmodernist dictator. You have said that it is about the building of a narrative, that the building of a narrative and the dissemination of the narrative that a given politician or dictator builds is a very important tool of politics and also a tool of war, because we are living in times, yes, when politicians have access to this narrative. After all, there's Twitter and other social media. I'm guessing that in the past it was not that important. Yes, the story, the created narrative that may be untrue and that may be disinformative would not be able to spread, right? And yet we are living in times when this story, once again, the word that is the building block of the story, seems to have enormous power. Yes, to the full extent it has a performative power, in the sense the power to create facts and create reality. There's a very interesting book, and now there's more material there for an essay than a book, so at times it does seem a little bit dragged out. But at the core of that book is something very interesting. It is a book by Gary Lachman, and he is a former musician of the band Blondie, who for some time now has been a successful author of non-fiction books, focusing first of all on the history of Western esoteric history. And he has written many excellent books, and he's an expert in the subject. He recently wrote a book titled Dark Star Rising. It is a book about the odd worldviews and the odd fascinations and inspirations that are manifested, are exhibited by prominent representatives of the American alt-right. So the people who are behind Donald Trump's victory, and Donald Trump himself is also examined there. Namely, Lachman claims that Donald Trump, when he was young, was a member, together with his parents, who would go there regularly. He would go to prayer meetings carried out in Brooklyn in New York by Norman Vincent Peale. He was an American preacher, one of the creators of this stream that then turned into those popular works as In Secret by Rhonda Burr. So he's a person who said that it is the power of our thoughts and the power of our desires and our deep convictions that we desire. We desire to become wealthy and powerful, and we desire to achieve certain objectives in our lives. He claimed that it is the power of the optimistic thinking, of the visualizations of our goals that guarantee achieving those goals. This kind of magical thinking in the way how Trump approached facts and reality is, according to Lachman, very clearly apparent. So the pathological lying that Trump is identified with, the fact that he was perceived as a person who says what he, as somebody who talks about reality as he wants it to be, then what it is, and then the fact that he stays with his lie 100% without worrying, and then decreeing on Twitter obvious non-truths, and yet he believes them so strongly that he hopes that they will become true. Well, this is actually something that Putin and Trump both share. This is their shared trait. this conviction that how I talk about reality will sooner or later become real, or actually that nothing beyond my deep faith in what I'm saying matters. I think this is something very specific to the Putin regime and the propaganda of disinformation that they are using. Now, Putin, it's not without reason that in his staff of advisors, Putin for a long time had Alexander Dugin, a man who for some time was the creator of the geopolitical narrative in the Putin staff. And he was a person who found a fascination in magic, the occult, and writings of Baron Julius Evola. So these are things from a fringe. They're from the second or third stream of culture that are usually not taken seriously, but paradoxically, these may actually be a very interesting lens through which we may view the events that are unfolding today. Let me just remind you of a book, The Occult Sources of Nazism by Nicholas Goodwin Clark, an Oxford historian, a very interesting person. Unfortunately, he died early, and he was focusing on something that seemed like a marginal fantasy, something completely overlooked, something that the mainstream is not paying attention to. Well, that actually may turn out to be an interesting key to understand seemingly incomprehensive, absurd, or odd, or shocking, or paralyzing events. Now, when we see Putin, who is indeed decreeing and claiming blatant untruths as if they were true, and who labels a clear aggression a peacekeeping mission, and also a government that has nothing to do with Nazism, and whose head is actually a person of Jewish heritage and of Jewish faith, when he labels them a Nazi government, well, I believe this deep faith in that, or this complete lack of accountability with reality. I just think that the strong faith itself, saying certain words makes reality true, is very strongly present there. So that the created reality, the reality created by this untrue narrative, for it to indeed become a reality, it sounds very paradoxical. For that, you need an audience. You need people who will hear it out, believe it, and who will be disseminating this information. I believe we are living in times that are very democratic as far as that is concerned, because principally anyone in this debate, in this global agora, anyone can take part. All you need is a smartphone with internet access. And today, practically everyone has either or both of these two things. On one hand, that is democratic, inclusive, and that is what is making us part of that community. But on the other hand, if we consider all of these pitfalls that you have just described, I believe that on that individual rests an enormous responsibility, because we become part of the fulfillment of the plan. It is thanks to us and via us that this reality is being constructed, that narrative reality, which in turn becomes genuine, or, well, actually fake reality, but yet a reality. Yes, that is the purpose of propaganda. Propaganda is there to subjugate the masses to your vision and to convince the masses to your actions. The whole point is to receive authorization from the masses and for the masses not to interfere with the realization of this vision. Of course, this magical theme is something that I decided to bring out as following Lachmann, and perhaps also taking into consideration that Alexander Dugin played and continues to play an enormous role in Putin's staff. So I was trying to find that kind of inspiration there. But this is also magical thinking in a purely psychological sense. You do not need fascination in real magical techniques to find magic in that kind of approach. Indeed, I would say that it is an assumption that the only thing that matters is the fulfillment of a certain goal. So there's a certain idea as to what has to be done, and later that is the only horizon, the only point that is visible at that moment. And reality besides the narrative and the ideation that one has becomes completely irrelevant, because it is also a kind of technology, a very pragmatic technology of achieving these objectives through methodical and cynical lying and representation of untruth as truth. This simply works. It is effective. It is not important what reality is like in truth. What is important is what you can convince people of. What matters is the image of reality that is favorable to us, and that we can also present to the people as true, also convincing them that it is true, and it doesn't matter what reality is independent from our fantasies, expectations, and desires, and that reality could perhaps verify these untruths. So far, this is working. When someone has such advanced technological advances in place, and when they have such advanced manipulation techniques, and when one knows how to use the information technology for the benefit of manipulation, at that point, this turns out to be effective. It works, and it indeed enables achieving more and more fantasies. However, there's a certain principle in psychology. According to this principle, and by the way, this remains universally true, and this principle will most likely activate here, this principle based on which what is true comes back, and the truth, even though neglected, it may not be neglected in the long run. Even the best organized propaganda campaign or military or political campaign, with its complexity, it cannot exceed the complexity of the world that we are living in. So ignoring the complexity of the world sooner or later eventually does come up against a kind of response from all that was ignored before. And I believe that sooner or later this is going to emerge here. What I'm saying is that this kind of radical interference that Putin is conducting now, and this kind of, well, genuinely, completely obvious to all observers, okay, perhaps apart from the group of people who are in contact only with Russian propaganda. So anyway, this kind of lie that is being in play here, sooner or later, this will have to be verified by reality. In other words, something is going to fall apart here sooner or later. Yes, sooner or later. On the other hand, the damage will have been done. There are people dying. Yes, so it's not just on an abstract level. Yes, so words are very important in these times, in the times of the internet, in the times of politics that often is played out on the internet. After all, and this is something we've already mentioned and we talk about it, there are politicians, heads of state, who are making important declarations first on Twitter. They're not necessarily holding press conferences for that. So this communication channel has changed, and we all are part of that, and we are also making true these fantasies of all kinds of politicians by believing these words. You have said something interesting. You have said that the question is, to what can we convince the people? We may slightly modify that claim by saying, well, that it's all about what people can be convinced of. So right now, I'm going back to the responsibility, the accountability of all of us, of all the recipients and participants of public life. And nowadays, public life mostly plays out online, because that is also the subject of today's meeting. What do we do so that this word-based, this verbal hatred is less? I believe, and let me go back to this point, that we are living in times when the responsibility resting on the individual is higher than ever before, wouldn't you say? Yes. Yes, especially as the individual, by using social media, for example, the individual may intentionally or unintentionally spark an avalanche. That's true unintentionally. Unawareness is another aspect. Indeed, a single post or a single example of hate speech directed at someone may start rolling a virtual snowball of hatred, of anger, of humiliation and outrage, and etc. A snowball that will cause not virtual, but will actually have real-life consequences. So indeed, I agree with what you said. I believe it is time to disenchant, on one hand, to make more realistic certain things, and I think it is high time for us to have an outlook, especially on social media, that is more disillusioned. And another point I wanted to make about the war. Authors of an excellent book called Like War, Weaponization of Social Media, there are two security experts that wrote that book, Peter W. Singer, and there's another author whose name eludes me, unfortunately. But these authors claim in their book that for a long time now, social media has been not only a tool for waging wars and identity wars, worldview wars, and political wars, and Twitter and Facebook are indeed full of these wars, and we often take part in these wars. We allow ourselves to get drawn into such exchanges that may be more or less aggressive and brutal, but social media has also become a battlefield for these wars that are conducted, or I should say wars that are being waged in other means than just tanks, armored personnel carriers, or marching armies. Some even say, and these experts agree, that based on the analysis of what is happening in social media in a given region, one may, with a high likelihood, predict if any armed conflicts will be taking place in a foreseeable future there or not, because the antagonization and the propagation of fake news and getting people involved in various kinds of mutual animosities is simply an absolutely, at present day, conventional set of actions that have entered the canon of military operations. So I believe that we need to be aware that, first of all, social media is a sphere in which we often believe that we are the party, that we create our profiles, our accounts, our avatars, and that we are the entities managing them, whereas, in fact, we are actually a commodity. Commodities that are actually subject to all kinds of trade agreements and transactions. After all, our attention and our engagement, and this includes emotional engagement, is something that is being traded here, something being sold here. This is written about, excellent, by Shoshon Lazubov in a book that recently was published in Polish, a monumental classic work, The Age of Capitalism and Surveillance. I strongly recommend that book because it really demystifies and shows in real light what era we are living in and what social media is and what the internet is today in general. Now, secondly, we are also, in a certain way, the ammunition in a different kind of game. This means that it's not only commercial entities that are, and business entities that are interested in playing out our emotions, our views, our attitudes, and our expressions in social media, but actually there are also other entities that are using these tools to carry out their own games and plays. This includes political entities. Yes, political entities as well. I believe that what is probably critical in general, and we will most likely get into details later, but if I were to, at the start of this conversation, if I were to formulate at this point a kind of recommendation, and at the same time if I were to draw attention to this territory that seems to be most critical and the most vulnerable also to such interventions, I would say that firstly we need to become very distrustful of the emotions that we are experiencing in social media, and especially emotions in the form of anger, of hatred, emotions such as outrage, and so on and so forth. I am not saying that we shouldn't be feeling and we shouldn't be trusting these emotions at all, but I would be far away from this myth of the popular psychology nowadays, this myth that is very robust and very widespread, that we always need to be following our emotions. I think that there's nothing more wrong than that. Emotions frequently deceive us and lead us astray. Emotions are exceedingly easy to manipulate today, and that is what's happening now in social media. Our attention is anchored, and our decisions are predicted, and people calculate what we're going to do, and later on that knowledge about our behavioral practices are being sold. Emotions are key to this. So I would first of all be very distrustful of these emotions that social media evokes in us. I would actually like to expand on this range of emotions that you have mentioned, because there's hatred, anger. These are emotions that by nature we probably should steer clear of, right? Yes, of course, there are also many positive emotions at play here. Yes, but there's also feeling touched, and there's also pity or mercy. These are also kind of deceitful emotions in a way, as they can lead us to share certain information, to share a certain post, because it may be untrue, it may be part of that constructed narrative. However, it, in a way, touches this emotional string in us. And I think that is a more deceitful or complex moment, isn't it? I absolutely second that. I also would talk about a sense of empowerment, a sense of elation, and a sense of being uplifted in full solidarity. Oh, that's the sense of agency we want to play our part. Yes, of course. Now, of course, we need to strike a balance here, because today we want to show solidarity with Ukraine and the Ukrainians. I believe that this is a very noble reflex. However, as it usually happens, it is a reflex that just imitates proper agency. I think nowadays we're not very tolerant of helplessness, and helplessness is a huge taboo in our society, and we find it hard to admit that realistically there's nothing we can do. And social media and certain gestures that we can carry out on social media, very basic ones, like for example having a template, an overlay on our profile picture or a post that we can share, that already gives you the impression that you've taken action, that you've done something. Now, I wouldn't condemn that, not at all. I don't want to speak from a completely Puritan perspective that mustn't be done at all, but we need to be doing that with a certain awareness. I would add to that this perspective of giving more reality to something that in actuality this action will not accomplish anything. Yes, excuse me, I just wanted to ask a question here, because it seems that the danger arises when those virtual gestures in the form of that profile picture of an affectionate, touching, and maybe beautiful and maybe important communication, if these replace real actions that we can take in real life, because in the end, a war, any war, is also tied to a refugee crisis, something that we will get to later. But I think this is a trap, that in these gestures, there's nothing wrong with them, provided that they don't fill us with a sense of fulfillment, I would say, when it comes to the humanitarian crisis, right? Yes. I think that this, to a large extent, is the equivalent of a psychological mechanism of experiencing certain events and emotions in our imagination, which often, maybe not often, but in these situations when it takes on this excessive form, it may lead us to not experiencing certain actions in real life. I mean, if we're constantly imagining, we start imagining that we will do something, but because we're imagining that, and because our whole emotional investment goes towards that imagination, then we don't carry out any actions, because all the energy, all the effort that needs to be unleashed to do something had already been, in a way, implemented and applied to that fantasy. So I think this can also be a relevant mechanism, although we don't need to be dealing with it. There's one very important word that I think came up. I believe it is important in the context of language and hatred and also war, and that word is dehumanization, because we started by talking about how word that builds narrative can be a tool of war in the hands of dictators, and how we, consciously or unconsciously, perhaps through our laziness or naivete or excessive emotionality, which often is caused by ignorance, and how we can become part of all that. But there's another important aspect, and perhaps it's even more important for our discussion, namely the connection between words and hate. And I think the concept here that we need to talk about is dehumanization, because dehumanization can be carried out in many different ways. And we already know cases from history, and this is something that we talked about. It's easier nowadays, but the classic example of dehumanization is the war in Rwanda, when the dehumanization with language and how language was shaping reality, a language in which one group was completely deprived of human traits, of human characteristics, and they were often compared more to insects. I have actually once heard a very interesting statement that genocide is a process that takes many, many years. And the fact that aggression, military aggression, takes place and that people start killing each other in real life is the effect of an accumulation of many years long, sometimes 20 years, sometimes slightly fewer. It's a process that took so long. So I believe this is an element that is extremely important, because once again, there is huge responsibility resting on us so that we do not give in to that. But perhaps I would ask for a reflection upon language, and for us to ponder the relationship between language and hate. Hate that may take on a physical form, a form of aggression and violence. So when do you think language becomes dangerous? One of my favorite thinkers, James Hillman, he often says that imagination precedes perception. This means that first there's imagination, and then what follows is what we can take in through our five senses. Or rather, that the imagination is a filter, or maybe even a form, a structure through which we see and perceive reality. That, I think, is really relevant to what you have just raised. That's because concepts, words, ideas, theories, they precede our experiencing of reality or our perception of reality. They constitute a kind of, perhaps not a filter, but they are a form within which and through which we view reality. So this is why the language or access to the masses through propaganda communication, that is something that actually every government, especially authoritarian regimes, have always put as their priority. This was always on their first place, always one of the core objectives. Of course, in the 20th century, this was raised to the rank of something that was absolutely dominant, thanks to the development of information technology. But it is my thought that the person that undoubtedly understood it well, or the people who comprehended that well, were the architects of the horrible crimes of the 20th century. Goebbels, Lenin, Hitler, and Stalin. They were all aware that access to language and access to mass imagination and the ability to shape mass imagination, and therefore the ability to organize mass emotions, to direct the mass emotions in the right way, to focus them in a certain way, they are aware that this is a tool of wielding power. I think that we very underappreciate it today. We underestimate how deeply language can shape this sphere of life and how it deeply shapes our reality. On the other hand, I also often find that we approach this in a way that is excessive, paradoxically. I just think that in various tendencies to codify and in our tendencies to use extremely strict and repressive measures to shape how we talk, and this is something we see on the liberal left side, I think that in a way shows the underestimation of how a non-obvious and complex and diverse reality language is, and how dangerous this kind of arbitrary interference with language can be. So, yes, but now with regards to hatred and language, I believe that, of course, we have a classic feedback here, feedback loop. So hatred and related emotions, they seek concepts, or they seek words that will fully become the vessel of these emotions, that will inspire, spark them in others. That is a characteristic trait of these emotions, that they are contagious. On the other hand, exposure to such terms, or a skillfully crafted message that can touch certain strings in us, may create these emotions almost out of nothing. I'm trying to say that indeed it has the power that we were talking about. A well-crafted propaganda text, a skillfully made message, may have this effect. It may take somebody who doesn't actually have any negative inclinations. They may take somebody who's an ordinary person, someone who is, let's say, a good father, an affectionate partner, and so on. So it can take somebody like that and turn them into an oppressor. I think this is something, a lesson that we have learned from the disasters and tragedies of the 20th century, and more than that. And I think we have learned this from the well-described and documented cases of genocide that we know. We know that in this case, in a way, anyone is potentially capable of such actions. I think that quite often we may think of ourselves as the ones who would absolutely not do this kind of thing. We think that we could not in any way or in any sense behave in a certain manner. But in reality, nobody thinks about themselves that way. Even Vladimir Putin believes that he has a peacekeeping operation that he's conducting in Ukraine. And I think nobody, much like nobody ever plans of becoming an alcohol addict, or nobody is planning to become a drug addict, but instead they are just using these substances because they are enjoyable and because they bring a kind of relief. Yes, so nobody ever intentionally plans to become an addict, and nobody intentionally wants this road to end in a position in life that will be dramatic in many ways. So just like that, nobody also ever plans to become an oppressor. These boundaries and these limits are always crossed unintentionally. Yes, they say that the best lie is a lie that we ourselves believe in. Yes, indeed, that's true. And I think we do believe many lies, especially lies about ourselves. We are the masters at self-deceit. But unfortunately, and I think now we will be very directly touching on this aspect of hatred, of online hate, etc., that's because social media brings out to light all of those characteristics, and they're making them seem enormous. They are enlarging them. Online, these characteristics become visible. This kind of primal tribalism, or this tendency to unite around identity totems, and also this trend to blend in with the group, to speak unisono, to talk to people who are similar to us, and to condemn anyone who is different, and this tendency to demonize and to dehumanize our opponents. Now, I'm going to say something that will probably come up against the opposition of many of our listeners. I mean, based on my expectations of our audience, I imagine that our audience are mostly people who are from the liberal left circles. That's my expectation. That is a circle, of course, that I identify with, and I assume you identify with those groups as well. But I'm intentionally going to use the following example because I would like to illustrate my idea that we usually do not see what is dark within us and on our side, and we are keen on seeing the darkness in the others. And that is a genuine challenge, a real problem. It's not all about noticing the problems elsewhere among those others, these kinds of trends, which, however, doesn't mean that they are not there. They are there, indeed. However, it seems to me that what is most important is to be able to see that nobody is free from that. We need to see that we, us, the people who always consider ourselves pure, good, morally responsible, aware of everything, right? We actually commit a fallacy by viewing ourselves that way and by losing our vigilance. So that's because we're starting to label the people that we don't agree with? Sorry, I interrupted you. Because we may really lose that vigilance at a certain point when we label the people we disagree with them, they, right? And then regardless of how convinced we are that we are correct, and even if we are correct, by using a certain kind of language, we are also participating in this process, yes? Of course, yes. What I'm trying to say is that one cannot responsibly call for, or we cannot responsibly condemn hatred and verbal aggression on, the side of our worldview opponents, whilst at the same time actively engaging in such means and letting ourselves be drawn into such situations. Well, yes, but that is incredibly difficult. It is. That's probably the hardest thing ever. It is the most difficult. But it seems to me that this is the only way. If you want to stop the spiral of hatred, what I'm saying is, oh yes, or on the other hand, if you want to in some way give more nuance to our perception of reality and to not allow ourselves be drawn in this kind of self-hastening system in which it starts with something innocent, but then the consequences turn out to be dramatic. I think quite often that may be the case. Often we fail to see on the other side, let's call them, on the other side we fail to see someone who's same kind of person as us. We don't see that on the other side there's a person with their emotions, a person who makes mistakes, a person who overreaches, a person who may say something silly or who may say something irritating or upsetting to others, or somebody who treads a path in life and then something happens with them, they become lost and confused and they're elsewhere, or they may feel embarrassed about what they had done in the past. Lots of us have such experiences, and by the way, this is what life is about. It's about making different mistakes, about missteps, making mistakes, and sometimes we make fools of ourselves, or sometimes we say something idiotic, and then we keep thinking to ourselves, how could I have said that? I don't believe that none of us in the audience ever had these situations. I had these situations, and I understand what it feels like. It is not something pleasant, but it just happens. We're all human, after all, and nothing more than that. But I think in social media, we are seeing a kind of absolute ruthlessness, and I think we're seeing a kind of this atmosphere of ruthlessness in which, well, you mustn't make mistakes, because when you do that, you're immediately subjected to, well, of course, if our mistake is made more public in Twitter or Facebook, when it gets to there, we are subjected to a process that was illustrated in one of the episodes of Game of Thrones, when Cersei Lannister has to walk naked through a crowd of people hurling the worst insults and objects at her. We all remember the walk of shame from that episode. So I think this is often how it plays out in social media today. Yes, continue? Yes, but getting back to the example, I wanted to use a very risky example of the Ordo Iuris scandal, the scandal that was the divorce and love affair scandal in the Ordo Iuris organization. Now, to make things clear, without a doubt, I'm glad to see that the hypocrisy of the radical right was bare for all to see. And I'm glad that, of course, quote-unquote glad, it's nothing to be glad about, but I think that it is good and it is positive that what we are witnessing is a clash of an unrealistic and inhuman, in many ways, ideology with the realities of real life, of human life. Yeah, just life, basically. I think this is a really valuable confrontation for the people that are exposed to this, and of course to all of us. Now, I'm, of course, in no way sentimental about the Ordo Iuris organization, which in many ways I deem harmful. But the scale of the horrendous hate that was hurled and that flooded these two people, and I'm also talking here about the lawyer woman, first of all, who all of a sudden became the main object of the online hate. I actually very carefully read many of the posts and of the tweets and so on about this scandal. And I honestly need to stress that the scale of hypocrisy of our circles that manifested in this case, this, on one hand, bloodthirsty moralism, and also so patriarchal, right? Yes, it was so sexist too. It was not only patriarchal, but also the sexist language that would objectify, that was just crass, rude, that was vulgar, and that was actually coming from the side of the people who were prepared in other cases to fight for much less drastic statements and were willing to condemn them for being an example of symbolic violence. I mean, that was actually extraordinary. I think that we have concentrated very much on what has emerged on the other side, and indeed something important and significant has emerged on the other side, but I think something emerged on our side as well. I think on our side there is also very much violence and there is much hatred. I still remember what happened online after the MP Szczepińska passed away from the Law and Justice Party, when circles that were fighting for democracy were suddenly overjoyed as a whole that the MP has passed away. By the way, let me remind you that she is a Law and Justice member of Parliament. She was their MP. Now, I'm saying this, of course, aware of the risk that comes with the fact when you're saying that something is wrong on our side. After all, it's wartime, and we mustn't be identifying any negative phenomena amidst our ranks. But indeed, this is a serious issue. This conviction in each of the sides that they are pure and that they have no biases, no inclinations towards hatred. And, they think the same. Of course, the right side of the political spectrum, they are specialized in verbal violence and violence addressed at their political opponents, and that side also believes that everything they do is justified, whereas their opponents are just evil people. So this kind of, by the way, deeply evolutionarily justified mechanism, this mechanism for idealizing and for putting a blind eye to the negative on our side and the tendency to exaggerate what is bad in the other side, this is as old as humanity itself. And it even is visible in the famous saying about the blade of grass and the beam of wood, namely that we notice the blade of grass in the eye of the opponent and we don't see the beam of wood in our own eye. This is a deep psychological truth, and I think it is very applicable to hatred today. Listening to what you're saying, it occurs to me that perhaps this is based on very similar mechanisms that we were discussing when we were talking about giving into disinformation unintentionally. I think that in this black and white world of social media, that's what we're dealing with, because I think that's how we can call it, that there's either the good or the bad, people who are with us or against us. The reality has become very black and white. And I think that those flashpoints, on one hand, are emotions of all kinds, but at the same time, the sense of mission and this sense of agency. The fact that I am on a mission, to, let's say, free my country from those fanatics, those evil people. And then that takes priority over the ability to view a human being as just that, as a human being, and that leads to the dehumanization process, yes? This, unfortunately, is, there's also a phenomenon that was described very aptly by you, that is being utilized to political ends or for the purpose of political battles or wars. Now I would like to perhaps draw attention to the right side of the political stage, and I would like to talk about the institutionalized application of hatred, or the application of a dehumanizing discourse, or a discourse that may generate certain ideas and perceptions about groups of people, that this government is actually activating and has been activating since the start of their time in power. Let me remind you that in 2015, Law and Justice, to a large degree, they have built their popularity, which later expressed itself in its electoral success, through anti-refugee rhetoric. So all of the mentions of diseases and parasites that are going to be brought to Poland, and talking about invasions or an attack against civilized Europe, that was used very consciously by Jarosław Kaczyński and the Law and Justice politicians, who later joined this who later added to this set of threats. I mean, after the migrant issue was pacified, they added to that LGBT individuals, and they once again activated another discourse in which a certain group, a rather non-specified group, but a group that can be identified through their sexual identity, that group that was supposed allegedly to be a danger to the cohesion of Polish families. I find it exceptionally dangerous, but I'm saying this because this kind of antagonism that we're seeing in social media today is antagonism that is often being played out through a kind of mobilization, a mobilization that has become a technique of aggregating social support by the politicians. It's my impression that we today, and this, by the way, applies to both sides of the political spectrum, if we're going to focus on the quote-unquote Polish hatred now, I think that we're being played out, and we're being mobilized to this political conflict, and we're being used to generate support for one or another political camp. And it is all being done by inciting an apocalyptic atmosphere, an atmosphere according to which we are right now dealing with a war between good and evil. One side is the good side, the other one is evil. And the good side has only good, and the evil side has nothing but evil. So the world, according to that, is split in half. And you need to pick a side. You mustn't have doubts. You mustn't question anything. All you can do is either support us, or that means that you're the proponent of the others. And of course you have a mission. Yes, of course. You're also part of this mission. You're part of the fight against the forces of darkness. Yes, and this, of course, may manifest on both sides. Absolutely. Yes, I think that's very important for our discussion. And once again, what comes up here is a language, which is very important. It is the conveyor belt of all of this. And you've mentioned something that I think I would like us to zoom in on, because you mentioned the problem, the issue of refugees. You mentioned 2015, the time of the war in Syria, and when we were dealing with a migration crisis. I think that this is a very interesting example. That's because certain words that were used by politicians in order to evoke emotions in us, such as fear and threat, they were later taken on by the media. Perhaps not with that intention, but these words that carried certain emotions then became part of the mainstream. For example, the word wave. Wave of refugees? Now, what does a wave do if we're talking about refugees? A wave floods and then everybody drowns. That's true. These are the words that conjure certain images, and these images create emotions, and emotions later lead to us making a certain kind of decision. The fact that we're joining one or the other side, and the fact that we take up certain positions. Yes, but my question is, it's interesting that these words can also transpire, they can penetrate into our lives in a way, and they do so in a way that, even when we don't have ill intentions, we use these words because these words somehow inadvertently pass through. Yes, these words are almost like viruses colonizing our imagination. We also need to keep in mind that it's not that we have ideas. Ideas have us. This means that we are the vessels for ideas, ideas that later are doing what they want in our minds, and ideas that can effectively colonize our thinking. We need to be conscious of that. We need to know that there's often processes taking place in us that are completely independent from us or our ego. But if we're on that, since we're talking about that period in time and that aspect, I think with mistakes were also made on the other side. I think this way of talking about this matter of the people who are supposed to be its favorable speakers and people who wanted to help these individuals, the migrants, I think their choice of words was wrong, not good. And I'm not the only person of this opinion. Nowadays, you see many leftist thinkers who are saying mistakes were made at that time. Namely, by the way, I think that this mistake was particularly apparent in Poland because, unfortunately, in Poland, any important case, including the pandemic and including the matter of the war in Ukraine right now, I think that any major cause is immediately being used for political plays and for political wars between the warring factions. I'm saying that any important matter is sucked in to this battleground, and you have one side grabbing one leg and another side grabbing the other leg. The pandemic is another topic that, of course, we can talk about in this context, but in the case of the refugee crisis, I think what was dominant in social media, and in liberal media specifically, there was a narrative according to which anyone who had doubts or anyone who was concerned or worried about what may happen in connection with the fact that there could be many people arriving to Poland from a different culture, with different customs, with different religions, behaving, looking, and speaking differently. So it was said that anyone who is afraid of that is bad, stupid, or backwards. And therefore, what kind of Catholics are you, right? You're lying Catholics if you have these concerns about these things. So that has largely caused the fact that the narrative of the other side, the side that managed these fears, that skillfully labeled them and directed these emotions in the right way, that fell on a very fruitful soil. So instead of a useful discussion, and by the way, you know what, people, first of all, they have a right to be afraid, really. We have a right to be afraid of different things, and the fact that someone is afraid of something, there's nothing bad in that. If you're afraid, it doesn't mean you're a bad person, and it doesn't matter if you're afraid of refugees, or if you're afraid of LGBT people, or if you're afraid of anyone else. It really doesn't have to mean that the person who's afraid is bad, is evil, and that they deserve only condemnation, and that we need to forcibly convince them that they are wrong. I think this is the best way to actually radicalize the other side, by mocking, by condemning such people, and by labeling them backwards and not keeping up with the times. It's about the lack of an attempt to understand the other side. Yes, this is something we call mentalization in psychology. So there's a lack of trying to reconstruct what's behind a person's behaviors, or what's behind a person's emotions and actions, etc. It's also a lack of empathic thinking. Yes, mentalization is a form of something that we can call empathy, although empathy is more focused on emotions, and mentalization is actually an operation that involves other cognitive resources. Anyway, if there's a refusal to debate certain topics, and if certain concerns and worries of people are not reflected, okay? If nobody is trying to name, to identify, to call these fears, and if nobody's trying to meet them halfway, if nobody's trying to show that this reality is perhaps not as scary as one may think, but on the other hand, it is important also to acknowledge that certain threats and problems are there indeed. So that we don't say that on one side there's a narrative that the problems are absolutely radical and there's going to be nothing but problems, and on the other side there's a narrative, no, there's no problems at all. Everything is outstanding. Anyone who believes there are problems, that means that they are backwards as far as civilization goes. It means they're evil or dumb or immature. So when you do that, the process of radicalization of the people who later may... Okay, because there's another thing to note here. We need to keep in mind that this pro-refugee narrative, that was a narrative of the liberal elites, the elites that were functioning at that time in the first row of the politicians who were in government. So the image of these people, it was often the image of people, these elites, it was the image of people who are leading completely different lives than the rest of the society. People who apparently drive excellent cars, people who make tons of money, and people who are living in gated communities, or people who perhaps have mansions in other countries that they can always escape to. But the fears, they were felt among the people who do not have access, of course, statistically speaking, to such resources. This is a process that Christopher Lasch, the author of The Culture of Narcissism, described at the start of the 1990s. He was writing about that in the book, The Rebellion of the Elites. It is a prophetical book that actually described everything that happened later in the world. By the way, he wrote that book, and soon afterwards he passed away. But the fact that the elites have grown too far apart from the people, and that the elites are leading different lives, they are living lives that are globalized, lives of people who are far from the realities of a vast majority of society. So that is actually another thread to this matter. I think that going beyond this model of the constant mutual humiliation and saying that if somebody holds a different opinion or if someone is not yet prepared for something that I think I'm prepared for, that means that they're evil and stupid, and the reluctance to have a conversation, a real conversation in which I may acknowledge someone's different experience, or maybe they're afraid of something, or maybe there's something I'm not seeing. So departing from this kind of conversation is a tragedy. I think that many people who had different concerns of this kind and who later were exposed in reality to refugees and who really came into contact with LGBT individuals, I think these kinds of people completely changed their worldview. But unfortunately, online, we're dealing with nothing but phantoms. Also, these fantasy creations that have been built based on those narratives, yes. But there's another thing that comes to mind here about dehumanization. You have just addressed how the refugees and, of course, quote-unquote, the strangers, the others, are dehumanized by their opponents. But there's another threat that I see. I think this dehumanization maybe dehumanization is a too powerful a word, but I think encapsulating a person in the cage of our fantasies may also occur and may also emerge on the side that is more, appears to be kinder to refugees, right? I think our fantasies about refugees, that the refugee is, this poor person who has nothing and they mustn't have any wealth, or they can't be a doctor. A refugee cannot have bigger aspirations than just receiving a warm meal. So this pity, of course, I think pity by itself is a quite noble feeling, but we all know what paves the way to hell, right? But anyway, I think that is also a threat. And we have also talked about emotions, and we're going back to these emotions. There are the negative emotions that in an obvious way give rise to bad phenomena, but often what is a problem are these emotions that are seemingly good, emotions that, when they're excessive and when they're disconnected from reality, due to our ignorance and maybe also due to our sense of superiority, may create another narrative, construct another fantasy that may also prove very dangerous. Yes, what you're just mentioning is a very valid point. I absolutely agree with that. I think that there are different directions and there are many non-obvious paths and many different unusual forms that the process takes on. This process of replacing reality with fantasy, or turning our back on reality and trying to follow this too much, this inner process, instead of being outwards oriented and instead of confronting the world for what it is. Definitely this kind of sentimentalization and infantilization is, in a way, I could even say violent. Yes, you wanted to say? No, because when you mentioned that, I'm remembering 2015. 2015, I remember this pretty famous scene that was seen in many pictures and videos when the refugees, they were on a train to Munich, and there were Munich citizens welcoming them with teddy bears, plush toys. That was, of course, exceptionally moving, touching, and beautiful, and nobody had ill intentions. But I remember a certain German journalist talking about this, and I think he was referring to a conversation with a Turkish friend of his who said that it was so humiliating. She, looking at it, was thinking, okay, how can you have an adult that comes from a really difficult place, someone with perhaps traumatic experiences, perhaps they're coming here without their dear one because perhaps that dear one has died, and greeting these people with teddy bears and plush toys is like this fulfillment of our Western fantasy about how good we are. Yes, although perhaps it was also a sign of helplessness it was also a manifestation of, okay, what do I do? What can I take? Maybe the intention was, all right, there's children there. Maybe there's children who are unhappy, they're sad, they're crying. Perhaps they lost someone dear to them. So, this exact case, I wouldn't view it very critically. But of course, probably somewhere down beneath, there could have been some kind of sentiment that you just described. But I think all of us keeps leading us towards the distrust, the lack of trust for our own reflexes, the fact that we need to slightly be reserved about what's happening within us. I think that the whole architecture behind social media makes us have this tendency to respond exceedingly quickly. So there's information that's just flowing in our feed, and we're suddenly expected to respond to everything with a plus or a minus, and we're supposed to express our emotions to everything. Because look at all these emojis that we are using, even based on their names, the emoticons, right? That is supposed to describe an emotional response. So many of us, I believe, have this impression that the world is escaping, that it's getting away, that things are happening very quickly. And in connection with that, our responses are also going to be something very quick. We're living under this terror of swiftness, of quickness, everything you need to form an opinion on right now. Something is happening, everybody's posting on Facebook, and we need to post too. We need to slap a like, we need to do something, and we need to feel something right away. I believe that it would be advisable to realize that this is a trap, that it's something that is conducive to very rash responses, that it's something that may lead us astray. It's something that often gets us emotionally wound up, and that it's something that makes us, before we consider our actions, we're already doing something, we're already talking, we're already joining something, joining a cause that perhaps after consideration we would not have joined at all. I can tell you, and you probably have seen this many times as well, there are many outrage waves that flood Facebook, that flow through Facebook about someone's words, the words of a politician or somebody else. So suddenly, you see a burning flame of outrage among the whole social media infosphere because, lo and behold, somebody said something audacious, etc. And very often, not always, but quite often it happens that as time goes by, it turns out that that person actually didn't say anything that bad, or that he had something else in mind, or that it's totally taken out of context, or that it actually sounded different. That's one thing. Another thing, there are so many fake verbatim quotes that are functioning in a meme form, often with the picture of a person that the quote is assigned to. I have honestly seen people who were, I could say, exceptionally reasonable, wise, and who seemed to have huge authority in the community, who suddenly were completely without being critical. They were just disseminating these quotes, attributed to some people, expressing their outrage. And those are quotes that you could tell, just looking at them, that was something that person never said. I mean, sometimes it was something so unbelievable for that person to say that it was even hard to consider that someone could thoughtlessly believe that, let alone someone very wise and very intelligent, etc. So I also want to make people more sensitive to that, because this shows how extremely misleading and confusing the social media sphere is, because everything in that sphere takes place so fast. A click takes only a second. Sharing a post takes only a second. The emotional reward that follows from that is instantaneous as well. In the meantime, there are tons of pitfalls, of traps, of all kinds of different rabbit holes, but, and I know these cases personally, often it happens that the people who become those quote-unquote heroes of those memes with false quotes. Quotes that are, by the way, usually very drastic, and they're supposed to provoke, to bait outrage, fury, anger. These people later on experience very real hate. So to their messenger inboxes, people send threats, people send insults, vulgarities. They are sometimes stopped in real life as well. So I strongly encourage everyone to take it slowly, to be reserved, to be careful, so that we never join this kind of online snowball and this kind of manifestation of huge outrage, of massive condemnation of others online. Yes, I also think that the online reality is, on one hand, as you're describing it, it's hellishly quick. On the other hand, it's very emotional. And then thirdly, it's so easy to do things. Like, it's so easily to delete someone. For example, an important and a discussed phenomenon right now is the cancel culture. Of course, we can't dive into that. We don't have time for that, and it's not on point. But getting back to the English word cancel. In the physical reality, if you wanted to break off ties with someone in the past, and you first need to meet them, you need to confront them, you need to process the whole issue. And now, in the online world, all you do is just click once and you delete someone. Or all you need is one out-of-context quote that is intertwined into a humiliating or a condemning meme, and suddenly that person is completely ejected from the community. Let's be honest, the pandemic has also made public life play out online, and it's so easy to be ejected out of it. It's very easy to be cancelled that way. Of course, yes, once again, you are right. Now, cancel culture is a very broad topic, and it's an intersection of many phenomena. Everything we've been talking about so far about social media, and about the particular, very special and irreducible and uncomparable quality that social media interactions bring to interpersonal relations. But on the other hand, it's also related to the vibe of this era, and it's also a derivative of this general tendency to even out differences. And this is something that is also follows from an upbringing, and its source are also certain ideological and philosophical beliefs, which of course zoom in and focus and are focused under the general label of critical theory, and that occupy a certain part of the radical left, and that radical left later being the side that is, of course, fighting for emancipation and equal rights, those people who are the speakers for empathy and nonviolent communication, and people who condemn violence. Very often that side, paradoxically, they fall into all of these issues that they're supposed to be fighting. Yes, and by using the tool that censorship is. That's true, censorship, but in best case, censorship. However, you also see numerous cases of people who, well, indeed, without any proper justification, without any bigger reason, they just said something silly, or they made a silly joke, and that immediately spread like wildfire across the world, and they were suddenly condemned as the worst people in the world. These people may have lost their jobs, or their personal image was hurt, and later if you Google their name, the first thing you see is that they're the worst people in the world. Yes, this is something that's also keeping in mind. I think that is, again, a very important lesson. Now, we only have 7 minutes left, so I apologize, but I need to interrupt you here, as there's also another important matter I would like to ask you. You have said earlier that we have a right to be afraid, and we talked about emotions much today. I think that fear is an emotion that unleashes many negative things. You have said earlier that sometimes what happens is that A regular teacher or a librarian or like a good father, suddenly in certain circumstances, they may transform into an executioner. And that fear, I think, is an emotion that unleashes a lot of that evil. Why do you think we're afraid of the other? Now, we don't have much time, so perhaps I should have asked the question before, but I think it is very relevant. Why do you think we're afraid of the other? And depending, of course, on how we define the other, or regardless of that, and how can we tame that fear? That is once again a very complex matter. Of course, it is an emotion that is based in evolution, and it is justified. There is a rationale behind it. It's not something that emerged without any sense, aimlessly, and it's not something that's always negative. So, in the conditions that the human brain and our nervous system was shaped, the whole range of our behavior and the whole emotional landscape we hold, fear of someone who looks and speaks different or someone who behaves differently had actually its deep sense. It had purpose, and the purpose of that was surviving. The goal was to manage to survive amidst wars and dangers. When I say war, I'm not meaning war in the present-day sense. I'm rather talking about predators and other tribes, etc. Indeed, all of that is a reality that shaped our species. And the emotions that we have now are the emotions that became formed in that time. So, it takes effort. And it is a very complicated and difficult work, and it's something that takes huge amounts of awareness to overcome and to consciously work on disarming, on diffusing these mechanisms that are activated, that are triggered in circumstances when the threat is not real. Yes, I think that what may be important here is language, and it may become very important because the quote-unquote other, as you said, in a way represents a reality we are unfamiliar with, and that, in a way, takes away our sense of control of what is around us. And by naming, by labeling, so once again, by using language, we are taming, familiarizing that reality in a way that may be very painful and very hurtful to the, once again, quote-unquote other. That's correct. That's correct. That is definitely true. But once again, I think we need to keep it real in this case. So, what do we learn from the Ukraine-Russia situation? The world is a dangerous place. Reality is dangerous, and people are also hostile towards one another. It's not that we're just one big global family and we all love each other. There is immense violence that is playing out in the world today, and there's people harming others, right? The people are behind that violence. I think a certain dose of realism and a certain dose of fear is something that is absolutely essential to function, because that fear prevents us from being someone who, with the use of different substances then takes away all of their safeties and safety measures, and they can then face something very dangerous without fearing. Okay, but when do you think this fear becomes dangerous? Well, yes, that, I think what you're referring to, is the core of the matter. We need to realize that these emotions, we need to know that these aspects of our cognitive apparatus, we need to know that they function in a way independently from us. That means that without constantly being mindful of what's happening within us, and without looking from a distance at our emotions, and without abandoning the dangerous myth that we always need to follow our hearts, and that we always need to trust our feelings, and etc. So without shedding and leaving behind these myths, we're never going to get out of this vicious circle of constantly reproducing violence. I think that the pathway to get out of this is to be distrustful, first of all, of ourselves, and of knowing that all of us, that we're all capable of violence, and that it takes effort, it takes work to depart from violence-based and violent patterns and structures and reflexes. And, the conviction that we're good and noble should actually light this warning light in our minds. If this is how we see ourselves and this is how we feel about ourselves, that should immediately sound an alarm in our minds. And I think that is the very important. Also, more mindfulness. Yeah, being more mindful and more vigilant of ourselves. Okay, so with that final remark, we're going to end our webinar. I would like to thank you very much. I would love to talk to you longer. Me as well. Yes, but unfortunately the 90 minutes is up. Thank you very much. Tomasz Stawiszyński, philosopher, essayist, columnist, bi-weekly in Tygodnik Powszechny, author of Skądinąd podcast. You can find Tomasz Stawiszyński and listen to him also on Talk FM radio. My name is Agata Kasprolewicz. I would like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, very much for this evening. And we're seeing and hearing each other a month from now. This was the first webinar from a series of several organized by the Polish Humanitarian Action. Thank you very much.